Welcome to the I Now Pronounce You Divorced podcast, where we have three award-winning family law attorneys dive into intriguing topics like divorce, military divorce, custody and visitation, trust and estate planning, and all things family law. Join us as we provide a comprehensive viewpoint through the eyes of our experts and guests, aiming to educate and soothe our listeners. Get ready to tune in because I Now Pronounce You Divorced starts right now. Hi, I'm Rebecca Malone, and we're here with I Now Pronounce You Divorced, where we talk about all issues of divorce, in and out, up and down, left and right, every single direction. Today, I am joined by Dan Cuneo and Paige Davis. Paige is our estate planning attorney, but she's here today to help us talk about divorce clients and what they're facing as they're going through the divorce on the estate planning side. What does that mean, and how do the two things relate to each other? So Paige, let's start out with kind of the beginning stages. If you have somebody who's just gotten separated from their spouse and they're like, I don't even know what to do next, what sort of concerns does that client have when it comes to their estate plan?
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. So the first thing you want to think about is who has control over, something happening to you in the event that you become incapacitated and that you cannot make decisions for yourself. So the first thing you want to do is definitely look at your power of attorney. If you've done one with your, the soon-to-be ex-spouse, right? You don't want that person having access to you in terms of if you are on your deathbed, being able to pull the plug and say, hey, do you want them on life support or do you not? If I'm going to divorce you, do I really want to trust my life in your hands? So I think the biggest thing really is just realizing what access does this person have over my life? What kind of control do they have? What kind of decisions am I giving them to make? And so you want to get an updated power of attorney. That's the first document, I would say, for sure. Even if you're not divorced, you can still choose another family member or just someone else that you trust, right? Along with that, there's other documents, your will, all those things you want to start thinking about. Hey, how do I actually want to provide for my kids? Now that I am splitting up from this person, now I have other priorities to think about. So I would definitely say you want to start with those documents.
Got it. And so, Dan, how do you kind of approach the estate conversation? It's probably not on the front of the client's mind when they're coming in to deal with a divorce. How do you sort of bring that up and make sure that we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's?
Sure. Yeah, it's usually not because they're coming in with such a defined issue or something catastrophic has happened and they just want to talk about that issue and not necessarily seeing the bigger picture. And that's our job as practitioners is, of course, to listen and to figure out what are the issues in the case and what can we do to help. But then to think the big picture and how does that apply and how could what your goals are affect or what is the issue? How could that affect something long term? And as Paige mentioned, the first thing usually is that power of attorney, and no one's coming in thinking that because usually when you implement those, right, you just kind of put it on the shelf, collects dust or whatever, and you forget about it. But to Paige's point, you're spot on because you're not thinking, oh my gosh, I put my life literally into my potential ex-spouse's hands. I need to change that. So we just need to go through kind of what does that list look like? And I always like to come into meetings not necessarily with a written checklist, but kind of a mental checklist as far as, all right, after we're done talking about what is most important to you, let's make sure we cover other topics and then tie in wills and trusts and kind of go into that whole estate planning without really getting into the granular part of it, but just broaching that topic so that it can be top of mind. And usually when you start talking about that, you can bring up the power of attorney and then they're thinking, oh, that's right, I do have that power of attorney. What do I need to do to make sure that that's taken care of? And of course, it depends on your jurisdiction, if anything is filed or not, and what can you do to amend it. And so there's just certain things that we want to make sure that we're following and implementing along the way without ignoring what the true goals are. So I just always want to know what are their issues, what are their goals, and then always tying in the whole trust and estates because it is, at least at a minimum, tangential to what's going on.
Right. I think for me, I'm always asking, have you ever written a will? Have you ever done a power of attorney? And sometimes it's, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, I think we did something. Great. I need you to find that. Find it, please. Send it to me. And then we can figure out what needs to be done. Because a lot of the time, if you've just gone through a very basic estate plan, you've named your spouse everything and your spouse has named you everything. And so, at a minimum, we have to get rid of that, right? We have to make sure that those documents are revoked and no longer in effect. We can destroy whatever copies are out there. And then we can talk about what to sort of fill in behind it. So, Paige, when you have couples who maybe one of them is in the military, and they've used the JAG office to get documents put in place, or something along those lines, is there any sort of different advice that you give to military families with their documents, or is it kind of the same across the board?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for military families, because they are in such a place of so much transition, most of the time they're overseas or they could be local, but because they are in more life or death situations, I think for them, I would make it more urgent because again, you may be here, in the U.S., but then you're going through divorce with someone who's being deployed. So I think for them, a lot of things I would try to let them know. Let's try to get this done as soon as possible because you don't want something to happen unexpectedly, right? And then this person's overseas, and now we have to contact them and try to get a hold of them. And so, for those families, I would definitely say they need to try to get it done as soon as possible. With the military, I would also say that it's very important to think about your kids. So, people tend to move around a lot. And so, do you really want to have a will, for instance, where it's just based on that state law and having property in that state versus, a trust? Because then if you're moving to another state, now your trust can actually be valid and you can have, that document valid, even if you move across states. So I would have them think more about moving around, if they were to move, what does that look like for you and your family as far as your estate planning, and also to consider, this person's out of the country. So how do I get a hold of them? How do I make sure my kids are provided for? And so for those families, I think it's very critical to meet with their estate planning attorney as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So another layer I would add to that, you may still have a need, right, for some limited power of attorney over something in particular. If you have a spouse who's overseas and you're trying to sell the house or something, even if you're separated, there might still be some sort of a need. How do you deal with those kinds of transactions when you're in the midst of this conflict within the family?
Yeah, it can
Yeah.
be challenging, I think, because I mean, you raise so many important issues that, especially when you're in the military, sometimes they're coming in and their orders are leaving very soon. And so there's just this rush just to try to get something in place. So the sooner you can start thinking about this, the better. And the sooner would be if there's any issue in the relationship or the marriage, reach out and talk to an attorney just to figure out what does that look like if it were to not work out, or what would it look like if you're overseas and there's some things happening. Because as Paige was mentioning on these parenting plans, you definitely want to make sure that you have put in there, at least when I practice and represent individuals in the military, I want to make sure that they have the ability to communicate with their kids and try to have defined times. Of course it's hard, but at least have something in there, so that way the other spouse is held accountable to make sure that you still can have somewhat of a relationship. And then really define what that means. And nowadays there's so much out there. There's Skype, there's Zoom, there's FaceTime, something available, right? That's not just by phone, by video, hopefully, so you can see and really continue with that relationship with the child. But then also, going back to Rebecca, you were talking about the JAGs. The JAGs are a wonderful source when you're in the military because they can do your basic wills and even kind of your basic trust. But if you want something more defined, that's when you really want to reach out to an attorney, because we can do the revocable trust, we can do the living trust, and we can make sure that you're actually taking your property and protecting and hopefully trying to mitigate as much that you can outside of probate as possible.
Got it. So, Paige, you mentioned having a trust and sort of having that be able to move around with you, or make changes with you. Can you walk us through what is the key difference between having a will in place versus having a trust in place?
Yep, absolutely. So with a will, of course, it has to go through what's called probate. Probate is court supervised process that can really be very draining, very daunting. A lot of people, most estates take, a 1.5, I would say a year and a half to 2 years to probate. And so it can take a very long time. And not only that, you have to go through probate, as I said, but also the fees. It costs a lot more. So now you get an executor, you have to also go to court. A lot of times you have to get an attorney involved. And again, it can take a long time. With a trust, it doesn't go through probate. So that's a key component of it, is that it doesn't go through probate. With a trust, you're avoiding probate. And so you're able to essentially make sure that, one, once the trust is set up, you're avoiding probate, but you're also protecting your beneficiaries from creditors, from others who may have, come after them, whether it's a lawsuit or some type of judgment. So it avoids probate, it protects your heirs, and you're spending a lot less. Attorney's fees to set up a trust may seem like a lot in the beginning, but once you get the will, you need to hire an attorney. If you're out of state, you may have to get an in-state executor to be the co-executor with you. And so the time frame, again, a year and a half to 2 years, versus when it's in the trust, it's automatically there. It's automatically going to go over to your heirs. So it's very immediately after your death, your heirs have access to those assets. So it's a lot more straightforward, a lot easier on you. Plus, your loved ones are grieving. So to have to deal with going through probate, having to go and qualify as an executor, having to go file the death certificate, and then hire a lawyer. These are all things that most people are not in the mindset to have to handle when their loved one has just passed away. So not to mention, there's, liability. So now creditors are coming and contacting you about your loved one's assets, saying that they owe them money. And so I've seen a lot of families just really find probate to be very exhausting, but also it costs them 3 times as much as a trust would cost them. The other issue with the trust is that, or not really issue, but I guess a benefit of a trust is that you can set up your trust for your kids in stages. And so a lot of people say, I've worked hard. I don't want my kids to just go buy a fancy car or squander all the money on a vacation. And so I want to make sure that my trust is set up to where they can get a certain amount of the trust assets over time versus all at once. And so that's very important because, again, you're thinking about legacy, you're thinking about building generational wealth. And so you're able to pass down your wealth to not just your kids, but also your grandchildren. And you're able to have that wealth spread out over time across generations. So that is another great way that trusts are really great for people who really want to build generational wealth. A will is very simple. You're leaving all your things to someone, and it's a very basic, again, estate planning document. You want to have that in place if you can't do anything else, but it doesn't really help you in the long run. And you also end up spending a lot more money to do a will.
Got it. And so for clients that are in this sort of middle ground, can they really set up a trust, or do they have to wait to get their divorce?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So if you are in the process of getting a divorce and this pending, you can still set up your trust, because here's the thing: you want to have everything ready to go. If you have kids and they were minors, especially, you want to make sure that when that your ex-spouse is not going to essentially have access to money that you're setting aside for your kids, right? Especially if they're used to having a certain lifestyle, they may think, oh, this is my money and I need to be comfortable, right? So you want to make sure that having a trust set up, you're ready to make sure your kids are taken care of in the event that you all have to, have a certain situation where you all are essentially not on the same page. They also may have different ideas about what funds your kids should have. So they may say, hey, I don't think you should have this private school, I don't want to pay private school tuition. Now your trust is set up to where you can have the money go to where you want it to go. And so even if you guys are not on the same page, you set that money aside. You would have a trustee who's not your spouse to make sure that they are managing those assets for your children.
Got it. So Dan, have you ever seen a situation where a client set up bad documents or didn't set up documents or something like that and have it have a bad outcome during their divorce case?
Oh yeah, unfortunately, one too many times. And it really just goes back to proper planning, kind of essentially what Paige is saying, that when you're going through this process as lawyers, we want to make sure we're advising the clients on everything, right? And that's just risk, not just associated with what's currently going on, but what does it look like from the will standpoint or the trust standpoint? And Paige touched on something, generational wealth. You're right, you work so hard. How can we continue to allow others to benefit from that and protect it from creditors and from others to make sure that it is secure? And it's going through the documents. I always like to advise clients as we're walking through this, let's start talking about what does a trust look like? Because we're already in your property. We're already in what you have. So what does that look like moving forward? Because as Paige mentioned, let's just start doing it together, because it just makes more sense. Because if you wait, then you're spending more time and more money, and you're delaying potentially any type of process. But when you have a lawyer who has either the knowledge of doing trust and estates or is part of a practice or a firm that has an associate or colleague that can do it, it just makes sense to get them involved early and often. So you know what does that look like? Plus, it allows you to start thinking, okay, is this something that I can part ways with? It? What can I do maybe to facilitate settlement? So this is something that we don't need to put in the trust. Or as you're walking through and you're thinking, yes, I want certain things in the trust and this is how I want it structured. Well, now you're starting to identify what's most important to you. So when it does come to those settlement discussions, you can make them a little bit more productive and fruitful as far as what you're willing to potentially negotiate on, and really what is a hard no for you. But as far as like war stories, unfortunately, there's cases. Well, I just had one a few years ago where they thought that they had the trust fully executed and it wasn't signed off on by both parties. It just was a draft. And so the other side took the draft and forged the other person's signature on it. And then we had to get experts involved, and we had to get the court involved to really just start walking through the whole trust and what was the intent of the trust. And not only was it come to fruition that their signature was forged, but that they were acting on the trust. And the person who signed my client's signature to it acted as a trustee and was moving things around and putting things in different accounts. And quite frankly, the only reason why that I discovered this was because we were doing discovery and we were sending out subpoenas to different bank accounts. And as we were just going through it, myself and my paralegal are like, wait a second, look at all these transactions going out and we're not noticing them coming in. And so then that led to further discovery, which then of course led to finding out that this is all because they forged client signature on a trust and was acting as a trustee and moving things around.
Oh my goodness. My sort of heart story with estate planning for divorce clients. I represented a woman in a divorce case. We ended up going to a trial. There was a lot of abuse. It was just a really bad situation. My client owned a house before the marriage. She owned a retirement account. He had absolutely nothing. And so the judge said that my client got to keep her assets, awarded her the divorce, everything. We were good to go. But my client passed away before the court order was actually entered. And so by operation of law, he inherited everything. They didn't have any kids together. So he got her house, he got her retirement, he got her life insurance. Everything went to this guy that the court just said, you don't deserve anything. And so she's unfortunately the example now that I give to my clients where, you just don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so if something happens to you, are you prepared? What would it look like? And how can we make it what you want and not, just what the law is going to force on you? So Dan, you also brought up for me another question. Paige, do you ever see requirements in a divorce case to set up a trust for kids or to turn life insurance to children or anything like that? Is that involved?
In a divorce case,
Yes.
requirements. Yeah, I think. I'm sorry, Rebecca. What do you mean by requirements? You mean
Yeah.
like?
So can you have a husband and wife like require each other that you have to buy a certain amount of life insurance or you have to put a certain amount of money into a trust for your kids? Can that be part of the deal when you're separating out everything?
Oh, I see. Yes. Yeah, you definitely can. Because estate planning attorneys work with family law attorneys, so like you guys were saying, it all overlaps really and truly because you're really trying to plan ahead for the best possible scenario for your kids if you guys have kids, And that's where I see it a lot, is just people having agreements, even with the settlement agreement or the separation agreement. I'm pretty sure there's some language that you can include in there, just to really touch on what does this look like for us as far as providing for a certain level of a lifestyle, but also for college tuition and things down the road, right? Because now we're getting a divorce, but there's other things that are going to come up. And so the best way you can handle that is to be proactive about what does that look like for us as far as where we are now. And just going back to your point, Rebecca, that was a really great, and Dan as well, what you guys said about someone leaving, you getting a divorce with someone and essentially they pass away. And so I actually have had clients, or potential clients, actually, they weren't even clients because we couldn't do anything, come to me and say, my relative, my aunt died, and the husband that she had, she's passed away. Her husband, technically never bought the house. He didn't own anything. She owned everything. And essentially there wasn't a will, or there's no will. And so they want to ask me, how can they make sure that he doesn't get anything? Because they're saying that this man was abusive. He deserted her. He abandoned her. And they're saying, how can he, how is he still entitled to all her things? Well, I have to tell them, at this point, she's passed away. They didn't have kids. There's nothing that we can do. And so it is really tragic when I think about it, because I've actually had this come up more than once, where other family members step in after someone dies and says, I want to make sure that spouse doesn't get anything. And at that point, it's too late because they already passed away. The divorce was never finalized. And so that was just a great point I wanted to reiterate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys both for joining me today. Again, this has been I Now Pronounce You Divorced, where we talk about all things divorce. So if you liked this episode, please hit that subscribe button, send us questions. We would love to talk in some more detail about trust and estate planning and how it affects you when you're going through a divorce. Thanks again.
Hi, this is Dan Cuneo with I Now Pronounce You Divorced. Thank you for taking time to listen to this week's podcast. Please join us next week for part 2.
Thank you for tuning in to our podcast. If you found this episode helpful and you want more informational content, please be sure to subscribe and join us on all major social media platforms, including YouTube. Stay connected for more exciting updates and tips.